President Bush does have the almost complete support of the American public on this one, and his demeanour and his delivery over the last few days has won him many supporters, even those people who didn't agree with the idea of a ground offensive in the first place. The main reason for that has been his plain speaking.
One other thing that Dick Cheney also said, he repeated it was not an objective of the US policy to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Do you believe that?
I think that they probably would say that publicly at least. No one really knows, of course, what they're thinking privately, but the latest opinion polls do indicate that the American public at least do regard the removal of Saddam Hussein as one of the main objectives here. Let's not forget that the American support for this war has been built up on the basis that they do regard Saddam Hussein as the real bad guy in this whole conflict. They certainly believe that the only successful outcome of this war would be the removal of Saddam Hussein from power.
Have you managed to get any reaction yourself from the American public on the street, or have you seen any or heard any on the radio? Are they out asking people what they think about this?
I think it's difficult to estimate at this particular stage, but from what I know so far, the American public almost feels a sense of relief. That might not be quite the right word to use here, but at least they seem to know that, that something is happening. Certainly this morning there was a mood of inevitability here. People really didn't believe that the ground war could be avoided, even though there was a certain amount, a large degree, if you like, of diplomatic wrangling at the UN, and people really didn't hold out any hope at all. There wasn't the kind of feeling you had before the UN deadline earlier when the war actually started, where people were wondering exactly what would happen. For the most part here, people believed that a ground war was inevitable.
That's Linda Double in Washington. Thank you very much. We can now cross live to Dhahran, to our correspondent there, Jackie Rowley. Good morning again, Jackie.
Good morning, Tim.
What can you tell us since the last time you were on, please?
There are two developments that seem to be coming through. One is that we are hearing that they believe that they may get through this attack very, very quickly. One suggestion is within 36 hours, but certainly the strength of what is coming out is that it's going well and that they are expecting to punch it forward quickly. The other is that there is a suggestion of many surrenders on the border. This was one of the things that the Allies were hoping for, that there would be a surrender by particularly the conscription forces in the front lines. This has been happening. The extent of it is difficult to gauge, but that is another hopeful sign. In terms of the actual development of the strike, obviously we're rather restricted in what we can say. We do understand that the 7th Armoured Division is involved, possibly going around in a flanking movement to attack the Republican Guard, the elite unit. That's on the Iraqi side of the border. Also an amphibious assault does appear to be underway, but there is some doubt about whether this is a feint, if you like, whether this is a diversion or whether this is a main landing force. The situation is confused, and as you will understand from Dick Cheney, the deliberate intention is not to allow information to get out at this stage which would in any way help the Iraqi military to find out precisely what's going on and what's going to hit them where next.
Indeed it is, Jackie, but I mean, I'm quite impressed with the information you've just managed to give us there. Can you give us the source of that? Is it just military sources are saying?
Military sources are saying. I think we'll leave it at that.
Yes, indeed. Can you clarify, you said 36 hours that they can punch a way through. Do you mean they can drive all the way through to Kuwait in 36 hours, or they can get through the initial line of defence in 36 hours?
I think they're talking about the initial lines at this stage, but you have to bear in mind that from Kafji to for example, to Kuwait is only something like 60 kilometres. When I was up there a week, 10 days ago, you can see Kuwait City. Certainly you can see the smoke and so on the horizon. It's not a fantastic distance because it could take a long time to get there, but we also do hear that they're already punching forward. We heard yesterday, in fact, they were unable to report it, that Allied forces had already moved well through the sand berms towards Kuwait even then.
You're saying also that your military sources are saying that there are many surrenders already. Does that lead you to believe, or do the military people themselves believe, that therefore the Allied bombing campaign, 5 weeks of it, that led up to this ground attack, has been successful and has knocked a lot of the fight out of the Iraqis?
Yes, absolutely. That was part of the intention, this relentless bombing. against the Republican Guard and against the frontline troops. It was hoped that this would be one effect. We've already seen it, of course, in huge surrenders at Kafji and major surrenders in the last few days during assaults forward through the front lines by the Allied forces. I should stress, of course, that there is something like 500,000 Iraqi troops on the other side, so that even if they're giving up in 400 and 500s, that still leaves an awful lot of troops to fight, with a lot of fight in them. Dick Cheney was suggesting the strength of the Iraqi forces. This is not a fight that is by any means over if there are surrenders, but it is a sign, a hopeful sign in terms of the coalition forces, if our sources are right and that is happening.
Jackie Rowley in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, thank you very much. We'll come back to you later. Well, the land offensive began as Baghdad came under heavy bombing raids and Iraq launched another Scud missile at Saudi Arabia.
US-led coalition military forces launched the ground war around 0100 GMT after Baghdad ignored the deadline for withdrawal from Kuwait set by Washington. President Bush immediately broke off his weekend break at Camp David and headed by helicopter for the White House. News of the attack was broken by US television networks just minutes after it began. It was later confirmed by the US administration. As it got underway, it was reported that Allied troops had engaged Iraqi forces along a 125-mile front. The 17,000-strong US amphibious force was said to be in position off Kuwait, and the US Marines were believed to be moving in. It said that the Defense Department will not be releasing many details over the next 24 to 48 hours to avoid giving the Iraqis any information which could help them select a possible location for a chemical weapon attack. Hundreds of prisoners have been taken by the Allied forces, and Iraqi soldiers are said to be surrendering. On a television broadcast at 0300 GMT, President Bush confirmed that the offensive was underway, but for security reasons gave few details of military strategy. The liberation of Kuwait has entered a final phase, he said. As the next phase began, Baghdad came under intense bombing, and Iraq launched another Scud at the Saudi Arabian capital of Riyadh. With 700,000 Allied troops now moving in on an estimated 540,000 Iraqis, military sources say it's going to be a long war. Susie Walton, Sky News.
At the same time as President Bush gave his speech to the nation this morning, John Major made a statement announcing the start of the massive ground attack on the Iraqi troops. Mr. Major said the assault was in order to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait and secure the full implementation of the Security Council resolution. He said of the British troops, "Our thoughts are with them and with their families. We pray to God that they will return home safe." Well, the coalition ground forces prepared for the offensive by deploying Apache attack helicopters into no man's land. Paul Beaver of Jane's Defence Weekly looks at the first successes.
The coalition commenced its ground operations with a combination of air, naval and land actions, using its advantage in night vision and other high-technology systems. Several days ago, US Army Apache attack helicopters were moved up to the front line with Kuwait and Iraq, capitalizing on the Iraqis' apparent weaknesses to move into no man's land. Apaches were in action almost immediately. They had deployed forward, but not against tanks. They were moved into position to engage Iraqi communications towers and tank parks. In this remarkable footage, taken through the infrared sighting system of an Apache in Iraqi-held territory, we see the 30mm high-explosive incendiary rounds of the aircraft's cannon engaging the solar panels which are used to power a communication center. We see that the grounds are hitting not only the panels, but also the tower itself as the gunner tries to sever the supports. At the top of the tower, the Apaches destroyed the antenna, which is the main communication center. They also engaged and shifted their target towards Iraqi tanks and armored personnel carriers, which were identified and engaged with the Hellfire laser-guided missile. The helicopters were supported in this operation by multi-launch rocket systems, firing from within Saudi territory, but giving accurate fire and bombardment in order to support the helicopters and divert the attention of the Iraqi defenders. History and historians may well record that the Apaches of the 6th US Cavalry opened the ground offensive. This is Paul Beaver of Jane's Defence Weekly for Sky News.
Well, the US Marines have destroyed 33 armoured vehicles and taken 200 prisoners during intense fighting near the Kuwaiti border earlier tonight. Traces of chemical weapons have been found by Marines which have apparently leaked from an Iraqi storage site after it was hit by bombers. This report from Sky correspondent Jackie Rowley.
Marine Harriers returning from bombing missions as the air war goes on. While the diplomats argued about deadlines, Allied pilots flew a record 1,200 sorties over Kuwait and 100 against the elite Republican Guard in southern Iraq. And they intensified their strikes against Baghdad with the heaviest raids in weeks. Flying with the bombers, a U-2 spy plane, rarely seen but playing its part as the air war enters its final phase, the ultimate softening up process before the ground war begins. And from Riyadh, new figures showing the extent of Allied successes. Some 1,700 Iraqi tanks destroyed, 925 armoured personnel carriers, and nearly 1,500 artillery pieces, all taken out, representing some 30 to 50% of the principal weapon systems at Saddam Hussein's disposal. On the battlefield, more intensive preparations for the final assault. Columns of US armour punching their way into Iraqi territory, opening up corridors for advancing Allied troops. Now close by in the Gulf, a 17,000-man amphibious assault force is ready to go. They've been waiting and training for 6 months, the largest US Marine force ever to stay at sea for that long. When the attack comes, it's not even clear what role they will play, whether they'll storm the beaches in a full-scale landing or launch a decoy assault to tie down Iraqi troops on the coastline.
What they kind of tell us is, you know, we're going to make history because there hasn't been an amphibious landing in a long while since such a great force out there against us. So, you know, about 90% of them are really ready to go for it.
But tactical surprise is still part of the strategy, and the only thing that's certain about the ground offensive is that military officials say it will be bigger than anything seen since World War II.
Joining us again in the studio now is Paul Beaver from Jane's Defence Weekly. Paul, can you give us an overall view of what the military situation and what has taken place so far?
Yes, we understand that basically the action began at 4 a.m. Local time, as the Americans have put it. And basically, if we look at the map here of what has happened, Kuwait City there is very prominent, I think, in the minds of the coalition forces. The initial operations were 2 thrusts, one along the coast road to the very east by the US Marines, another US Marine and US Army operation about another 50 to 60 kilometers to the west, both of them driving up north. And then we heard about an hour ago that Felaka, the island which is offshore Kuwait City there, was taken over by the US Marines. They made an amphibious landing, air power having destroyed about 33 various vehicles, armoured fighting vehicles, tanks, etc. And then there's also a report which is still being confirmed that basically the US Army have also been around trying to separate Kuwaiti forces, or Iraqi forces in Kuwait rather, from Iraqi forces in Iraq proper, probably trying to separate the Republican Guard from their strategic reserve. So it's a very complex but very simple in terms of military command structure operation.
What about what Jackie Rowley was saying to us from Dhahran about 5 minutes ago, that they're saying, probably off the record, that they're looking at 36 hours to punch their way through the first line of defence? That's what, to go about a mile?
I think that probably what they're talking about, there's 36 hours to reach their first objectives. Now I would imagine that their first objectives would be to punch through the Saddam line and to get themselves established inside Kuwaiti territory.
The Saddam line is the main line running down the border.
Yes, the Saddam line is what we've been talking about now, I think, for the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's this amazing amount of concentration of trenches which are oil-filled, minefields, barbed wire, dug-in positions. And what's happened in the last 3 or 4 days is that the US Marines, the French, the British, the Saudis have all gone through this line. They've found weaknesses in it, they've penetrated it, they've cleared minefields. And so they were able to go in at night because they had already had this reconnaissance, this information there. The assault engineers had been in, removed the mines, for example, so they were able to drive through and penetrate. What we haven't seen, of course, is what everyone expected, or a lot of people expected, some sort of massive attack across the frontier and troops moving in one cohesive wave.
But is it possible that that's actually happening, but we don't know about it?
No, I don't think so. I think that sort of problem that, for example, if you think of back in the days of the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war, thousands and thousands of troops were killed because of this World War I mentality of putting wave after wave over the top. It really isn't necessary in a modern war. The coalition have got the technology, they don't need to do it. They've got the armour, for example, they've got the air support. And of course they've got continuing air support all the time. Air raids are continuing. There have been something now like 95,000 sorties flown in 5 weeks. Not all of those, of course, offensive operations, a lot of transport and refueling operations, but the bulk of the air operations directed now against the Republican Guard and other troops in Kuwait.
Now, I've just been looking at a report here that apparently President Mitterrand of France is saying that French troops have also been ordered into the ground offensive. So we know about British 7th Armour Brigade, certainly the Americans, obviously, and now the French. Any Arab forces in the coalition, will they have been involved from the beginning?
I would suspect that the Saudi armed forces would have been involved in the beginning. After all, Saudi Arabia is the host country and the country originally threatened by this. They proved that they were capable of dealing with the Iraqi forces which had come across to KG, the National Guard, for example, which is an elite in their army, will probably be involved. They've already involved in artillery exchanges with the Iraqis, so they are ideal people, and of course they speak the language, so of all the Iraqis who are surrendering, they are ideal people to deal with the initial filtering of theirs before being passed back to other coalition forces to become enemy prisoners of war.
Finally, for the moment, of course, will the air raids, bombing raids firstly, be going on, and will the air forces be flying a lot of missions as air cover and air strike involved in a ground attack?
Yes, well, what we've seen in the last 5 weeks has been a